A lot of important things happened in 1979. The Seattle Supersonics won their first and only NBA championship, the despotic Ugandan president Idi Amin was deposed, Fleetwood Mac released their second, horniest album of all time, Tusk, and the science fiction horror thriller Alien landed in theaters on May 25th.
Alien, coming this summer to a theater near you.
The little movie that would go on to become a surprise box office success and would spawn a cinematic universe featuring 5 canonical films, a few crossovers, more than 24 video games, a library's worth of comics and novels, odd toy lines,
Drake, Ripley, 8-Bone,
one weird theme park ride that wasn't directed by James Cameron,
What happened to A-Squad, soldier?
and some of the most iconic moments in cinematic history. It's a franchise with so many different creative minds behind all of its films that it's evolved into one of the most varied universes visually, emotionally, and allegorically. The horrors of space, the horrors of sexual violence, the horrors of capitalism, the horrors of working with Hollywood studios, and of course the harrowing silence of God that is so loud you make 2 whole movies about it. And outside all of that, they're movies about groups of boneheads and milk robots sticking their faces into space eggs and getting picked off by the most terrifying movie monster ever, which is fun for everybody. With all those movies, books, video games, the eventual release of Alien Romulus in 2024, and Noah Hawley's upcoming Alien TV series, you're probably wondering how massive the timeline of the Alien universe is. Just gonna assume you are since you clicked on this video, or you left autoplay on and this was next. Either way, thank you. We're gonna break down the expansive timeline that stretches across the 6 main films and fill in some spots with help from some of the comics, novels, shorts, and special features. We'll also be touching on some of the non-canonical films and media that aren't officially a part of the timeline, but it would feel wrong not to include them in this video.
A f***ing alien.
And we'll dip a bit into the history behind some of the productions, the themes of the films, and how both possibly play into the overall lore of the franchise. Our sources for this video are the films themselves: Alien, Aliens, Alien Cubed, Alien Resurrection, Prometheus, and Covenant, the special features, deleted scenes, and commentaries found across multiple versions of DVDs, the quadrilogy, of course, specific comic book arcs, the Xenopedia Wiki, and the 2014 book, The Weyland-Yutani Report by author S.D. Perry. To keep this video streamlined as possible, we're focusing on the timeline events that correspond the most with the films and the main characters: Ellen Ripley, Elizabeth Shaw, David, and Weyland-Yutani, the ever-present evil company throughout the films.
I work for the company, but don't let that fool you. I'm really an okay guy.
Like I said a minute ago, there's a lot of Alien novels out there, and they're all like 300+ pages long, and I'm being very upfront with all of you and saying that I did not read any of them. I just don't have the time. If I was going to include all of them in this timeline, the video would be much longer than the 43 minutes it is now. Thankfully, the internet can be helpful sometimes, especially with cliff notes, so certain books and dates that connect to the events and characters in the films will be included. Books like Out of the Shadows and River of Pain will be touched on in some way, but books like Aliens Criminal Enterprise or Aliens DNA War won't make the cut. If you're a scholar of the Alien novels, please feel free to educate me in the comments on whatever I may have missed. Also, we won't be mentioning the Alien anthology shorts that were released in 2018. They're cool and there's some fun ideas in some of them, but they have no connection to this timeline whatsoever. It's gonna be a long one, so pour yourself a drink, strap up your Reeboks, and by the end of this video, maybe we'll figure out whatever the hell this is. Neat. The first mark on our timeline is one we can't put a hard date on or even tell you which planet it actually occurred on. The opening of the 2012 film Prometheus shows a tall, pale, and completely smooth alien being standing alone on a mysterious world atop a waterfall that looks a lot like the Dettifoss in Iceland, but the time and planet are never confirmed. I'm gonna go ahead and call these aliens the engineers right now, even though we know that they don't get that designation until Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway of the Prometheus crew give it to them way later in the timeline, which we'll get to.
We call them engineers.
And I know they have different names and titles from different media like the Oseans, the Malakak, and Space Jockeys, but we're gonna go with engineers. The engineer downs some evil looking chia seeds and is quickly eaten from the inside by an aggressive black goo, which we're not really going to dig into. The pathogen, also known as this, has its own mythology and science and confusing properties that we don't have the time to really get into the minutia of. I'm sure someone has a video somewhere on YouTube that breaks down the whole Xenomorph life cycle if you want it. The engineer melts into the water below, spreading the bizarre DNA he just ingested across the planet, like passing out in a hot tub while you're drinking a daiquiri. We gotta mention the alternate opening of this movie where there's actually an audience of engineers viewing that one poor bastard who slams back the goop. The theatrical version we got feels more like a conscious decision by this being to seed this world with his DNA, whereas the alternate opening feels more sacrificial or even more like a punishment, but we'll touch on that a bit later. Next, we're jumping all the way to the Bronze Age on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, 35,000 years before Elizabeth Shaw discovers some cave paintings.
Did you date it?
35,000 years, maybe older.
This is around the time in human history where the earliest evidence of humanoids living in Ireland first sprung up, and approximately 1,000 or so years before the last glacial maximum. During this really unpleasant time to be alive, an unknown number of engineers visited prehistoric peoples and imparted either wisdom or warning about those big glowy things in the night sky. Things are quiet for a bit until around 90 CE, when the engineers made themselves a little bunker on the moon that's designated LV-223. There they started to initiate a plan to wipe out humanity for reasons that we will get to later. The team of bald lurches screwed up and lost control of the deadly syrup, which wiped out most of the engineers on LV-223, except for a few who locked themselves away in their spaceship and slipped into their sleep sarcophagi. And that's where we're leaving the engineers for a good long while. This is the part of the timeline that doesn't technically fit into the full Alien timeline, mostly due to specific films being owned by different studios at the time of production. But it would feel wrong to not mention the tangentially related movies and events that interact with the Alien franchise.
Not again!
Sorry to the Batman/Aliens comic, you did not make the cut. The first stop in this section is in the film Alien vs. Predator, thousands of years ago, with no real date to go off of, where ancient civilizations were visited and ruled over by the Yautja. Yautja. Unique New York. The Yautja are an alien species from the planet Yautja Prime, and are more commonly known as predators.
Well, we took a vote. Predators cooler, right?
Yeah. The whole ancient aliens angle with predators making sacrificial temples full of xenomorphs is kinda silly, so we're not really gonna spend a lot of time on it. We spring ahead to the Great Plains all the way in 1719, where we meet Naru, her brother, and a whole mess of French fur trappers who have the terrible luck of crossing paths with this big guy. The feral predator is eventually outsmarted by Naru, who returns to her people carrying her trophy and a flintlock pistol she was given by a trapper, which is inscribed Raphael Andolini 1715. This retcons a very esoteric bit of predator history, which we'll get to in just a second. The fate of Naru and the Comanche is left slightly ambiguous to anyone who hasn't read a history book, but foreign invaders rarely bring peace. Next, we get a small glimpse at an encounter between a predator and a xenomorph at a whaling station in Antarctica in 1901, and then we jump 86 years to when two future American governors and their band of mercenaries are sent to an unspecified Central American country to rescue a head of state, but it turns out to be a shadow operation run by the CIA, which is very unlike them. Dutch, Billy, Mac, Dylan, Shane Black, and the rest of the fellows cross paths with a predator that landed in the jungle just before they got there and has been having a blast just skinning Green Berets. Other than being the original Predator film, it doesn't connect too much to the timeline, aside from giving us a bridge to Predator 2 and a buttload of great quotes.
Yeah! Stick around.
You're bleeding, man.
I ain't got time to bleed.
In 1997, we then jump from the actual jungle to the concrete jungle, Los Angeles. It's more like 6 or 7 concrete jungles that are 20 minutes away from each other. LAPD Lieutenant Mike Harrigan is in the middle of a turf war between feuding drug cartels during an intense heat wave, and that's on top of everyone already having Con Air fever at the movies that summer. Good summer for movies, 1997. Great. To make things worse, a predator gets in the mix, wreaks some havoc, kills some drug lords, and cuts Gary Busey in half. What's he holding on to? Show it again. What's he holding on to? There's no top half. The character that Gary Busey is playing was originally supposed to be Arnold Schwarzenegger's Dutch, but he declined. Long story short, Harrigan finds himself aboard a Predator spaceship complete with a trophy case of different skulls, one of them clearly in the shape of a Xenomorph skull, which is the first crossover nod between the two franchises on screen. I know about the comic, we're not talking about that. Harrigan is rewarded for his victory with the same flintlock pistol that Naru got in 1719, which retcons the lore of that pistol altogether. Raphael Andolini was originally a character that appeared only once in the 1996 Dark Horse comic short story Predator 1718. In the comic, Andolini is an Italian pirate whose crew turns on him when he decides to return a lost treasure to the Catholic Church. Don't do that. His rightfully mutinous crew is defeated by Andolini and the Predator named Greyback, who we see at the end of Predator 2. Andolini would die during this combat, but he gives the Big Ugly a flintlock pistol as a thank you back in 1718. From the year 1997, we skip all the way to the year 2004 and the Paul W.S. Anderson movie, Alien vs. Predator. Now, despite all the things in Alien vs. Predator that makes it feel tied to the Alien franchise, it doesn't actually hold any canonical weight. The motivation behind AVP originally came about in the early 90s, following the release of the Alien vs. Predator comic in 1989. James Cameron and Ridley Scott had actually considered working on a 5th Alien film together, but when Fox started pushing the AVP of it all, both Cameron and Scott lost interest, and Ridley would eventually turn his initial idea into the movie Prometheus years later. In Alien vs. Predator in October of 2004, Weyland Industries discovers a massive temple 2,000 feet below the ice of Antarctica. This is where we get our first non-canonical appearance of Charles Bishop Weyland, played by Lance Henriksen. This is the only time we see this character. Technically, there is you'll see. The dying CB Dubs assembles a team to go investigate the massive discovery in hopes of cementing his legacy.
Let's make history.
And things go about as good as you'd expect if you travel 2,000 feet down into a murder temple. And that's more or less where the Predator connection to the Alien franchise ends, at least film-wise. In the 2010 film Predators, Isabel does mention the 1987 team, Dutch, Dillon, etc., but that's about it.
6 men plus a CIA liaison. Only one made it out.
And supposedly there's a Xenomorph / Predator hybrid in Alien vs. Predator Requiem, but it's hard to talk about that movie since it's lit by one iPhone flashlight. Our final stop in this section of the timeline lands us in Los Angeles in 2019. In the 1982 Ridley Scott movie Blade Runner, there's a bushel of references and connections that tie the Blade Runner universe to the Alien universe. Not officially, of course. There's major similarities of the tech we see in Blade Runner, even down to the purge screen we see in Goff's car, which is the exact same screen Ripley gets when she's prepping Narcissus at the end of Alien. On the 20th anniversary DVD of Alien, the special features titled The Nostromo Dossier highlights details about the Nostromo crew, including a small note that Captain Arthur Dallas was at one point employed as a cargo ship pilot for the Tyrell Corporation. On the special features of the UK Steelbook of Prometheus, there are journal entries from Peter Weyland, the founder and godhead of Weyland-Yutani. In these notes, Weyland reflects on his long-departed mentor, who had once tried to convince Peter to come work for him so they could take over the world and become new gods. This is like run-of-the-mill CEO talk. Peter Weyland also writes that this nameless mentor of his used to run his corporation, quote,
like a god on top of a pyramid overlooking a city of angels. Of course, he chose to replicate the power of creation in an unoriginal way by simply copying God, and look how that turned out for the poor bastard. Literally blew up on the old man's face. I always suggested he stick with simple robotics instead of those genetic abominations he enslaved and sold off-world. Although his idea to implant them with false memories was, well, amusing is how I would put it politely.
The entry continues with Weyland basically taking a victory lap about how much better their robotics division is than Tyrell after they figured out milk blood technology. Okay, I added that last part. Tyrell's name never gets officially dropped in the journal entry, but it feels pretty obvious who Weyland is talking about here. An egomaniacal man who lives atop a shining temple overlooking a city of titular lost angels whose attempts at playing God blow up in his face, along with his eyeballs. There's also a comment from this mentor for Weyland to put away childish things, which could be Tyrell making a connection to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, because, once again, God.
Nothing the god of biomechanics wouldn't let you in heaven.
And it's very likely Tyrell's use of the word toys was a jab at genetic designer J.F. Sebastian, who created friends like Bear and Kaiser.
They're my friends. I made them.
And probably the most obvious thing connecting these franchises together is from Ridley Scott himself.
I went through an Alien into the environment of the Nostromo and people living with close and close proximity with people who still have earthbound connections And here we have people on Earth. So almost this world could easily be the city that supports the crew that go out alien. In other words, when the alien crew comes back in, they might go into this place and go into a bar just off the street near where Deckard lives. That's how I thought about that.
And while Ridley said it could be an easy way to solidify the validity of these connections, the studio rights to these films at the time they were made is a big canonical hurdle to get over. But here in 2023, both Alien and Predator are owned by the same mega huge conglomerate, and that's always a good thing, right? One of the veins running through the entire Alien universe is the ever-omnipotent avatar of capitalism that is Weyland-Yutani and its founder, Peter Weyland.
And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to change the world.
Just to reiterate, we're sticking to the movie canon, which is already a lot. We're going to do a quick Weyland bio on our road up to Prometheus. We're currently in our pre-Metheus era. Peter Weyland was born in Mumbai, India in 1990 to wealthy parents. His mother was a professor of comparative mythology, and his dad was a self-taught software engineer. Peter Weyland was a prodigy who received a method patent for his synthetic trachea that he constructed entirely out of synthetically engineered stem cells. Typical Libra. This would actually be his 12th registered patent to date, and on October 11th in 2012, the Weyland Corporation was formed when he was only 22. On March 27th of 2015, Weyland made his first $1 billion and his first successful industrialized space mission thanks to renewable energy collected by his company's solar panels. Weyland also helps curb global warming in 2016 thanks to developing a synthetic atmosphere that's put above the polar ice caps. He gets knighted in 2017, and that same year acquires the rights to NASA's Project Prometheus after funding for the project fell through. Now, NASA had never had a Project Prometheus, at least as far as the public knows, but the Jupiter Icy Moon Orbiter was for sure real. I keep reading that as Juicy Ass Moon Orbiter. At NASA, the JIMO project was an unmanned shuttle with nuclear propulsion that was designed to explore the icy moons of Jupiter, which may contain life, just like in 2010, the year we made contact, a movie that everyone has seen.
What's gonna happen?
Something wonderful.
Unfortunately, funding for this project fell through in 2005 after NASA shifted back to manned missions. We'll keep checking back in with Weyland and his company throughout this entire timeline, but right now we've got some really dumb scientists to talk about. In 2023, hey, that's now, Weyland was granted its first patent for method and apparatus for synthetic individuals. There's like a lot of patent talk in this, don't worry about it. At a TED Talk, remember those? In March of that year, Peter Weyland drops the big news that they started making robots.
These rules exist because the people who created them were afraid of what would happen if they didn't.
A year later, in 2024, Weyland manufactured their first advanced android prototype model named David. Weyland welcomes David into this world by exposing him to a healthy dose of God complex and Christian iconography, like Italian Renaissance painter Piero della Francesca's The Nativity, and Michelangelo's statue of David, where Robot David chooses his name from. This kind of feels like a setup by Weyland. I mean, like, what else was he supposed to call himself based off things in that room? Piano? Meet my son Piano.
Steinway.
The Japanese cybernetic startup, the Yutani Corporation, files a lawsuit against Weyland for the patent of the android, which Weyland wins in litigation in 2029. Weyland starts buying up aerospace and defense companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman in 2032. And in 2034, Weyland unveils their first faster-than-light capable vessel, the Heliades, which is named after the daughters of the Titan god Helios and the ocean nymph Clymene. In 2039, the Weyland atmosphere processor is deployed to help create the first breathable atmosphere on an extrasolar planet. That tech will be used for decades to come throughout this franchise. We're gonna fast forward a few years to 2079 to say happy birthday to the 8th generation of David, the latest synthetic model produced by Weyland and powered by Verizon Fios. Remember that? That was dumb. David is the pride and joy of Peter Weyland, way more than his own daughter.
He is the closest thing to a son I will ever have. Unfortunately, he's not human.
David was given the Titan classification, a connection back to Weyland's TED Talk in 2023.
The fire that danced at the end of that match was a gift from the Titan Prometheus.
And very likely inspired by his mom's influence. Peter would pass along his supernormal obsession with gods to his synthetic son, a very smart thing to teach a supercomputer that can never die and also has hands. In April of 2079, multi-hyphenate Dr. Elizabeth Shaw sends one of what sounds like dozens of messages to Peter Weyland via some Yutani branded technology that feels very Voight-comfy.
If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because I've been calling your office every day for the last month.
She appeals to Peter Whalen's motivations to discover who created us and why, with an extra helping of optimism, most likely in the hopes that Whalen will offer some sort of assistance or funding for her project. Aside from Japan, India, and the United Kingdom forming the three-world empire in 2088, there's a gap of about a decade in between this message from Shaw and her discovery of those cave paintings on the Isle of Skye in 2089. Shaw makes this discovery with her scientific and life partner Charlie Holloway, who's not Tom Hardy. This cave painting matches 6 other various pieces of ancient art and architecture that depict large beings pointing to a series of circles, which is identified as the Zeta II Reticuli star system. This is apparently enough to get Whalen's attention because in 2091, Prometheus takes off for LV-223 with a crew of 17 and 1 hidden old guy. It seems like Shaw's optimism must have rubbed off on the old cajillionaire.
I think they want us to come and find them.
On January 7th, 2092, on the Olympia colony on Earth's moon, Ellen Louise Ripley is born, and in 2093, construction of the USCSS Covenant begins. That same year, after 2 years in hypersleep, Prometheus arrives at LV-223, one of the 3 moves that are orbiting the gas giant Kalpamos on December 21st, 2093. Shortly after arriving, the team discovers the remnants of structures the engineers left behind, along with their plans for humanity, one in stasis, one who didn't do enough cardio, and a whole storeroom of that pathogen that the tall guy chugged all those billions of years ago. They take the severed engineer head back on the ship, which is just one of like a dozen stupid things this crew of dum-dums gets into. The whole mission is like a dunce Olympics.
Hey, baby.
All of these missions needed like one Waffle House employee on board, and none of this would have happened. Like that lady who caught the chair. Like, snatch it out of the air. Love her. David learns that the engineers were actually heading to Earth with the intent of destroying the planet. The specific reasons are a little muddy, but it seems like the engineers were not happy with the way humanity turned out. In an interview with Fandango back in 2012, and I'm paraphrasing here, Ridley Scott said that the engineers were constantly thinking about the Roman Empire and how humans had screwed everything up so bad they sent an emissary to Earth to tell them to straighten up and fly right, but they crucified him, heavily implying that Jesus Christ was actually an engineer, which is false. He was a carpenter. Not to rehash a movie that's over 10 years old that everyone already fought about for way too long, but a creator searching for their creator and then being killed by his creation by the creator's creator to only reveal that it's all nothing is kind of fun. It's not subtle in any way, but it's fun. It's better than what's coming.
I gotta take a leak.
Peter Whalen reveals that he's actually been on board the Prometheus the whole time, and demands to be brought to see the lone engineer that David found in the sleep sarcophagus. After waking up, David speaks to the engineer on Whalen's behalf, and the engineer responds by doing his best Al Snow impression and bonks Whalen off the timeline. Captain Janik and the fellows stop the engineer from completing his trip to Earth. Shaw escapes the engineer thanks to the squid she had cut out of her body earlier in the movie, and we learn that Meredith Vickers can't turn left. Go that way, Shirley's. At the end of the day, the only ones left alive are Shaw and David, who says that he can take Shaw to meet the creators.
Yes, I believe I can.
The last transmission sent by the Doctor is on New Year's Day 2094.
My name is Elizabeth Shaw, last survivor of the Prometheus. And I'm still searching.
And then things get Shaw repairs David, and the two plot a course for the home planet of the engineers. David puts Shaw into the sleep coffin and then starts his plan to kill God, like Ilya Ivanov in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. So many dead chimpanzees. There's no hard date about what transpired on board the ship before eventually arriving at the unknown home planet of the engineers at the most distant edge of the galaxy.
We were finally going to meet our creators.
How long?
Impossible to say.
The crowd on the planet below is super excited about the vessel returning after thousands of years away, but they're in for one big surprise.
Weird Al Yankovic is on the plane.
Unfortunately, no. David opens the main hole and drops the pathogen payload onto the population below. This wipes out his creator's creators and transforms the entire environment and biology of the planet, which makes it look like spooky Tuscany. Shortly after this mass extinction is probably when David began his failed experiments on Shaw to turn her into Sarah Kerrigan, basically. And he also set up his own Mutter Museum. Back on Earth, the Whaling Corporation absorbs Yutani Cybernetics and becomes the highest valued company ever recorded on the Systems Exchange in 2099. Sometime shortly after that, the mega powerful conglomerate releases their newest model android, Walter. The Walter models are more like robot butlers and not as independent as the David Model 8s, which was probably a business decision after the most important David led his creator into a death trap and is somewhere out in space just making nightmares.
You were too human, thinking for yourself. Made people uncomfortable.
According to the Colonial Marines Technical Manual, the United States Colonial Marines Corps is established under the National Security Act of 2101, which just basically amends that the Marines fight on land, sea, air, and space, now that off-world colonies are a common thing. And aliens too? In the 2014 novel Sea of Sorrows by James A. Moore, there's mentions of mankind making contact with sentient alien life that doesn't have a bloodlust for humans. By late 2100, Earth had established trade with an alien species called the Arcturians, who are mentioned in Aliens.
You sure wouldn't mind getting some more of that Arcturian? Remember that time?
Yeah, bro, the one that you had was male.
It doesn't matter when it's Arcturian, baby.
And Alan Dean Foster, author of the Alien novelization, name-checks their home planet as well. In 2101, the USCSS Nostromo, named after the 1904 Joseph Conrad novel, was constructed as an interstellar cruiser, but will be retrofitted 15 years later as a towing vessel. In 2103, the United Americas were formed after Central America and South America were swallowed by North America, essentially, and the Covenant colonization mission is announced. Despite a sabotage attempt by a revolutionary cell known as Earth Savers, the Covenant launch is successful, with 2,000 colonists and 1,140 embryos on ice, and an operating crew of 15, who we meet for a short moment before they enter hypersleep. In December of 2104, a stellar ignition damages Covenant and causes the crew to wake up 7 years before they reach their destination, the planet Origai 6. The crew also picks up a voice signal from a mysterious planet that never even popped up during the years of research to find an inhabitable new home.
It's beyond your most optimistic projections of Origai 6.
How did we miss this? We scanned the entire sector.
Despite the giant red flags raised by Chief Terraformist Catherine Daniels,
it's too good to be true.
Too good to be true? What do you mean by that?
Captain Chris Oram, an idiot, makes the brilliant decision to land on the ominous rock, where they find nothing but death and David, who has been growing out his roots. David reveals to Oram that he's been working on his little hobbies for close to a decade, and then pulls off the easiest gotcha of all time.
Take a look.
Gotcha.
He's done nothing but lie to you the entire time since you've got there.
Is it even safe here?
Perfectly.
Oram wakes up and quickly learns why sticking your head in a big wet egg is a terrible idea. After just a bloodbath of crew members, Daniels, Walter, and Kenny Powers successfully get off the cursed planet and return to Covenant and start charting a course back to Origai 6. Unfortunately, David is great at impressions and trades places with Walter during their scuffle. He puts Daniels into cryo after revealing himself, relays a fake transmission that the Covenant crew died from a solar flare.
All crew members apart from Daniels in Tennessee tragically perished in a solar flare incident.
He then places 2 facehugger embryos in storage, and that's the last we see of David. For all we know, he's out on Origai 6 creating aliens and misquoting Shelley.
Byron.
Like Prometheus, Covenant has a lot of religious tones, themes, subtext, and lack thereof just thrown all over the movie.
Because you can't be a person of faith and be counted on to make qualified, rational decisions.
I know writers who use subtext, and they're all cowards.
The leap from wanting to meet God to wanting to replace him through violence and science is a fun swing, Ridley.
What we have tried to do here is to really scare the shit out of people.
We don't know the fate of Covenant and its colonists, but the movie gave us 2 important things: 2 Fassbenders kissing. As we exit the post-Metheus era of our timeline, we're just going to take a small break before we dive headfirst into the Ripley-verse, the film that started it all, Ridley Scott's Alien. Timeline-wise, there's no major events that we can find that happen between the end of Covenant and the plight of the Nostromo. There's probably a ton going on behind the scenes in the expanded Alien universe as a whole, but nothing that earns a mention on our timeline in the 18 years between the 2 events. In 2120, the Nostromo departed Earth on what would become its final trip with a crew of 7. Captain Arthur Dallas, Warrant Officer Ellen Ripley, Thomas Kane, Joan Lambert, Dennis Parker, Samuel Brett, a secret synthetic named Ash, and Jones the Cat. After a stop off on Thetis, the Nostromo crew is woken up out of cryosleep after receiving an unknown distress signal while traveling by the Zeta 2 Reticuli star system. Despite multiple dissenting opinions, the crew of the Nostromo is contractually obligated to investigate the signal, otherwise they won't get paid.
The penalty of total forfeiture of shares.
And this is where we learn one of the biggest lessons of the Alien franchise. Mother, the command system aboard the Nostromo, reroutes the ship and the crew lands on the moon LV-426, which is right next door to LV-223, give or take a couple million space miles. Soon after landing on the rock, which is not nearly as pretty as LV-223, Dallas, Kane, and Lambert discover an engineer ship that looks like it's been there since the first Easter, and it's just choked with xenomorph eggs, just lousy with them. I know that Prometheus and Covenant working as prequels tosses a ton of events in Alien into a blender. Why was this fossilized engineer trapped on LV-426 instead of 223? Why was the ship filled with xenomorph eggs despite David being the creator of this species? And why is every person so compelled to be face down in danger eggs? We don't have any answers on that front, so if you have a gripe with any of this, take it up with Ridley Scott.
F you, thank you very much. You. Go f yourself.
After some time in the med bay, Kane ruins everyone's lunch, and the crew is left to fend for itself against the Michael Jordan of movie monsters, which makes the Nostromo crew the 1995 Seattle Supersonics. Yeah, that works out. The crew gets picked off fairly quickly. Ash attempts to kill Ripley after she finds out Weyland-Yutani's plans for the creature, but they're a company that's really bad at making robots with strong necks. This revelation from Ash shows that Weyland-Yutani, at least at this point of the timeline, has some kind of knowledge about xenomorphs, at least enough to know it exists, and that it's important enough from a business standpoint for them to sacrifice the lives of 6 people and millions of pounds of resources to get it. Ripley and Jones make it aboard the escape shuttle Narcissus, also named for a Joseph Conrad novel, and she launches the xenomorph into space with her signature move, opening the airlock. Ripley and Jones prepare to go into hypersleep, and she leaves a transmission regarding the fate of the Nostromo.
I should reach the frontier in about 6 weeks. With a little luck, the network will pick me up.
Nope. As I mentioned at the top of this video, there are a lot of pieces of Alien media, especially novels and novelizations, and we're not going to dive too deep into them. The 2014 book Alien Out of Shadows by Tim Levin directly references Ripley and the Narcissus 37 years after she escapes the Nostromo and before she's discovered in Aliens. Long story short, Ripley's shuttle is hacked by Ash, who implanted his brain into the computer system and then is taken to a mining ship called the Marion, where multiple mining crews have just also discovered xenomorphs. So Ash is like, yes please, give me, I'm all about it. Ripley gets caught up in a bloodbath and then is placed back in stasis and has her memory wiped by another character because she keeps having nightmares. Basically, Ripley didn't need to be in the book, especially when we know she's alive in Aliens 20 plus years from this point, but she's in it, so we figured we'd put it on the timeline. In 2157, a Weyland-Yutani terraforming colony was plopped on the surface of LV-426 and is named Hadley's Hope for its founder, Curtis Hadley, who is just some guy. 57 years after Ripley escapes on the Narcissus, her shuttle is discovered by a salvage crew who miraculously comes across her ship floating in deep space in 2179.
And it's really just blind luck that a deep salvage team found you when they did.
There's a few things we have to touch on here, like for starters, we find out that Ripley had a daughter named Amanda,
Ripley McLaren,
who was born sometime in the year 2111 or 2112, even though the date of birth and date of death listed on her file makes absolutely no sense at all. There's like a 59 in there and she possibly died in 2120, despite Burke saying she died 2 years ago, or maybe that's just her Dave & Buster power card points.
and that was at the time of her death, which was 2 years ago.
Also, pixelated images are still a problem in 2179. The whole thing's a mess. And I know we're talking about Amanda Ripley years after the events of the video game Alien Isolation, which features her as a main character. It just doesn't really add anything here. I'm sorry. Also in Aliens, there's a quick mention of Hyperdyne Systems, the synthetics corporation.
Yeah, the Hyperdyne System's 128 too.
This is a James Cameron movie, but thankfully Hyperdyne and Cyberdyne have nothing to do with each other, which means the Terminator timeline will not show up on this list, which is for the best. Ripley gets dragged in front of a bunch of bureaucrats in car seats, where they berate her over loss of company property, strip her of her flight credentials, and ignore her warnings about the alien nest the Nostromo crew found on LV-426, which is how Ripley also learns about Hadley's Hope.
It's what we call a shake and bake colony.
How many are there? How many colonists?
I don't know, 60, maybe 70 families.
Weyland-Yutani most definitely knew about the existence of xenomorphs in some form before the Nostromo floated by LV-426, before they willingly sent dozens of families there in the hopes of digging them up.
And it was wrong. It was a bad call, Ripley. It was a bad call.
Bad call.
Right.
These people are dead, Burke!
A mom-and-pop team of surveyors under the direction of Carter Burke come across the engineer ship on the surface of LV-426, and things go about as well as you'd expect them to go. The movies don't show us how Hadley's Hope fell into chaos after the facehugger was brought back, but the 2-issue 1992 comic Aliens Newt's Tale by Mike Richardson and James Somerville gives us a look at how everything went to after Newt's father returned with a face full of alien. A few days after losing contact with Hadley's Hope, a rescue mission is put into effect, which Ripley reluctantly agrees to join to ensure the alien threat is stomped out for good.
But to wipe them out.
You have my word on it.
All right, I'm in.
And it f***ing rips.
Where's Basky? Eat this!
Get away from her, you bitch!
After things get food-barred down on the colony, Ripley finds the Queen, torches a whole mess of eggs, plays some Steel Battalion, nukes LV-426 off the map, and launches the Queen out the goddamn airlock. Ripley, Newt, Hicks, and both halves of Bishop go into hypersleep as the Sulaco, named after the ship in the novel Nostromo, heads to Earth, and everyone goes on to live a full and happy life. Nope. Turns out there was an alien egg stashed away on board somewhere, and like a flock of geese to Sully Sullenberger, it takes down the Sulaco. Unlike Sully, they don't stick their landing, and everyone besides Ripley perishes on the shores of Fiorina 161 very shortly after they escape LV-426. Like a few days, maybe a week. It's never confirmed, but it's like right then. Ripley's unconscious body is brought to Weyland-Yutani's Combo Industrial Smelting Factory / former correctional facility that's mostly populated by bald British character actors. And Charles S. Dutton, who's just throwing fastballs the whole movie.
You got a blade and you take it out and you f***ing use it!
Shortly after watching Hicks and Newt get laid to rest Terminator style, a stray facehugger makes its way inside and then outside of an ox. Or a dog, depending on which cut you're watching. With Alien 3, there's two main cuts, the theatrical cut and the assembly cut that the film's editors put together with no involvement from director David Fincher, who hated working on the movie so much that he almost never talked about it until a very recent interview with Empire magazine, where he talks briefly about how horrible the experience was.
It's amazing to me that Fox is the #1 studio in the country because they're all such a bunch of morons.
Ripley takes a badly damaged Bishop offline, and the whole thing is just a huge bummer and a long list of bummers.
I'd rather be nothing.
An earlier version of the Alien 3 script was written by Neuromancer author William Gibson and was going to be more focused on Hicks, who accidentally drifted into space and ended up in the middle of a conflict with space communists.
Space!
There was also a Vincent Ward script where Ripley ends up on a planet that's made entirely out of wood and is populated by monks, immediately in. Just to add to the pile, Ripley finds out she's got a bug in her and decides to go hunting in the hopes of killing the Xenomorph loose in the facility, along with the future Queen that's lurking inside her chest, and Weyland-Yutani is not happy about losing valuable property. Ripley and the two remaining inmates give the alien a molten lead bath, just as Michael Bishop, the supposed real Bishop, and Weyland-Yutani goons arrive.
You're a droid. Same model as Bishop. Sent by the fucking company.
No. I'm not the Bishop android. I designed it. I'm very human.
I know he takes a metal pipe to the back of the head and just keeps holding a conversation with Ripley while like half his ear is hanging off, but based on everything I found, that's actually the real Bishop. He's the Jack Youngblood of corporate ghouls. Ripley ends the murderous monster cycle she's been trapped in by leaping into the furnace below, just as the Xenomorph Queen explodes out of her chest. Or that doesn't happen and she dies in the furnace below, depends on which cut you're watching. But both results are the same. Ellen Ripley, the reluctant hero of these films, is finally able to rest in peace. Nope. We're coming to the end of our run here. There's a few events that fill in the big-ass gap between when Ripley pulled a Harry Nilsson and when we climb aboard the USM Auriga for its final mission. In 2202, the United Americas, along with the Three-World Empire, China, and 4 independent core system colonies, form the United Systems. 24 years later, the United Colonial Marines get a name change to the United Systems Military in 2226. In 2291, Weyland-Yutani was successfully sued for independence by the New Indy colony. I can't find any information on what the lawsuit was about or about New Indy in general, so if you know something about it, please leave it in the comments. 2 years later, Weyland-Yutani takes another hit when rival company Ridton puts a more advanced FTL drive on the market. This causes the USM to sign contracts with Ridton, and they throw Weyland-Yutani in the trash. In 2306, artificial persons from the Althea Collective were given civil rights, and every cybernetics division across the stars took a massive hit to their wallets now that synths can't be treated like tools anymore. We don't have a hard date for this next spot, but sometime after 2349, Weyland-Yutani, after becoming the massive conglomerate that gave humanity power to reach the stars in one super rich weirdo's hopes of meeting God, they're bought out by Walmart.
Well, they went under decades ago, get them in way before your time. Bought out by Walmart.
Walmart.
Walter.
In 2356, the USM secured blood samples of Ellen Ripley that were taken on Fury 161. We'll get back to that in just a minute. 20 years later, in a desperate attempt to save the synthetic persons industry, the first Autons were manufactured in 2376. Autons, who are more or less the children of synthetics, did not last very long. In the 24th century, these second-generation synths violently rebelled against their creators in an event called the Recall sometime in 2379. During the Recall, Autons burned their modems to cut their connections to the United Systems computer, which had been used to guide or reprogram previous model synthetics. The word around space is Autons revolted because
they didn't like being told what to do.
What had actually happened was the Autons realized that creators like Weyland-Yutani were using synthetics for unethical missions that would ultimately harm humans. It's like the song Goodbye Earl, but Earl is the blood-powered cogs of the military-industrial complex, and Wanda is humanity. Most of the Autons were destroyed, and the few remaining survivors fled into hiding. In 2381, the USM Auriga successfully produces a clone of Ellen Ripley using her blood samples from Furiona 161, thanks to their science team made up of every weird guy in your office. The clone is designated as Ripley 8, and the Xenomorph Queen, which was also reconstructed from her DNA, is extracted and boxed up. Ripley 8 starts to recall Ellen's memories, along with her love for and 1 basketball. She's got super clone strength, acid blood, cool weird claws, and a Shadow the Hedgehog attitude.
Who do I have to f to get off this boat?
The USM is clearly working outside of the regulations of space law, and that's even more obvious when a batch of alien sacrifices are delivered by a gang of pirates, including French character actor Dominic Pignon.
Who are you expecting? Santa Claus?
Love that guy. Eggs hatch, xenomorphs escape, Cher's dad bites it, and the few survivors left on board learn that the ship has activated its emergency protocol and is on a direct route back to Earth.
Earth, man. What a shithole.
Oh, and we learn that Winona is one of the Autons that escaped the recall. On their way to the ship the Betty, Ripley 8 stumbles across the lab where Ripley's 1 through 7 are being kept, and Ripley 8, Cronin burns the thing to the ground. Chekhov's chestburster finally goes off, and the worm is gunned down Murphy style. There's a couple whispers of RoboCop in this movie, actually.
The potential for this species goes way beyond urban pacification.
209 is currently programmed for urban pacification, but that is only the beginning.
Before they can jet off to safety, Ripley the 8th gets a face-to-face meeting with the Xenomorph Queen they cut out of her at the start, and we all meet this thing. The hybrid creature takes a look around for about 5 seconds before it gets sick of the place, and after it crushes a few heads, it's turned into cosmic gumbo by Ripley Ocho. The Auriga, along with the hive of xenomorph eggs on board, crashes super hard into Earth. Again, depending on which version you're watching, the endings are different, but mostly just in vibes. The theatrical version shows the crew reaching Earth and flying over a lush and beautiful landscape that kind of looks like a good screensaver. In the special edition of the film, however, we see Ripley 8 and Winona Bot sitting on a trash heap overlooking Paris after a weekend riot. Regardless of which one you prefer, they both end with the same line.
I'm a stranger here myself.
And that's where it ends, at least our version. A vast timeline of terror, gore, heroism, horny robots, and late stage capitalism. I know there's so much media out there that orbits these 6 films, and your timeline is very likely different from ours. If it is, please tell me what I missed. This whole video wouldn't have been possible without the resources provided by the very committed fans of this film universe. Seriously, thank you for your service. But tell us, what do you think? Do you think we'll ever see David again? Probably not. What are your expectations around Alien Romulus? Is there any other film universe you'd want to see a deep dive into? Sound off in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you around.